welcome to the Stoa. Very excited about today's session. Today we have the philosopher David Skrbina. David is he's a professional philosopher who has like a deliciously diverse interest space: eco-philosophy, panpsychism, the Jesus hoax, anti-tech movement. And he had a letter exchange with the Unabomber himself, Ted Kaczynski. And this book, I believe, was produced from it, Technological Slavery. And that is what David is here to talk about today, the philosophy of the Unabomber. So I'm going to tag in David in a moment, and he's going to perhaps talk about his connection and relationship with Ted, and then talk about his actual philosophy. And that will go for perhaps 20 some minutes, and then we'll pivot to Q&A. So if you have any questions anytime, put them in the chat. I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself, ask your question to David. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that, and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, David, welcome to the Stoa.
Yeah, hi, Peter. Thanks. Glad to be here. Glad to have a chance to talk and present some ideas in a little bit of depth, which is a rare opportunity, actually. So it's nice to be able to do this. So yeah, if you want me to just go ahead and jump right in, if that's okay.
Yeah. Feel free to take it however you'd like to take it.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I guess just by way of background and context, talk about my kind of connection with Ted Kaczynski. Yeah, goes back several years, I guess. Even before there was, let's say, before there was a Unabomber, I was quite a skeptic about technology. Quite critical in some of my own kind of thinking. Had not really done a lot of research, but had done a fair amount of kind of background reading, preparatory work, and so forth. Was quite critical of the way technological society was developing. I had read some key books like Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society, which is a key work published in English in 1964. And so I was familiar with quite a few of the arguments in Ellul. And then, of course, along came the Unabomber case in the 80s and the early 90s. And so I followed that with interest, like everybody else at the time. Got particularly interested when the excerpts of the manifesto started coming out in the early 90s. It was pretty clear that there was some kind of logic. It was kind of an intelligence behind this bombing spree. It wasn't just a random sort of killing, that there was a kind of real sort of thoughtful process behind this. And it was really kind of intriguing as these came out. So of course, when the manifesto was released in late 1995, immediately got a hold of it, started to kind of read through it, analyze it, saw a lot of familiar ideas that I had seen from my previous readings. Then of course, followed the Kaczynski trial. 6 months later, he was arrested. Put on trial. The trial lasted about a year. He ended up in life in prison in Colorado. He's still there today. And then pretty much that was it, right? So he drops off the radar. The media decides once Kaczynski's put into jail, he's pretty much done and gone, and we don't ever have to talk about him again. And that was clearly their intent. So the media, almost completely since that time, has given very little coverage to Kaczynski. At least the mass media. There's been some exceptions with film documentaries. We can talk about those later. But really, nothing had in the mainstream media really had covered him at all for many years. I started teaching in 2003 at the University of Michigan. Created a new course called The Philosophy of Technology. Was compiling readings for that book. I was going to include, of course, the manifesto, which was a recent critical piece in technology. But at that point, it had been, 5 or 6 years since Kaczynski was incarcerated. And I was kind of curious what was going on. I had heard nothing about him like anybody else. He was not in the news at all. So I decided to write him a letter. I had never done that before, never written to prisoners, so it was kind of a new experience for me. I was happy to send off a letter, just sort of a quick little letter saying, "Hi there, hi there, Dr. Kaczynski," and just introduce myself. It turned out I was teaching at his alma mater. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan, which is where I was teaching. So we had a nice little connection there. Sent him a letter with some questions. Didn't expect any answer, of course, but about 3 weeks later, got a nice handwritten reply saying, "Thanks for your letter. I'm going to give you a detailed response to all of your questions." And then about 2 weeks after that, I received a 20-page handwritten letter giving a lot of details in all the dozen or so questions that I had asked him. So, and that really kind of kicked off a process of sort of interaction back and forth. It turned out he'd been doing a lot of writing. He had written a number of essays while he was in prison, and those had basically gotten no publicity. He just had them in prison. And he wanted to modify the manifesto. He had some thoughts on some other things, and he was looking for some interaction. I started this little kind of a dialogue with him in writing with written letters, which was the only way to do it. It was a very slow process because the Bureau of Prisons is scanning all letters. They still do, of course. All letters going in and all letters going out have to be opened and read by the Bureau of Prisons. So it's a slow process. It takes several weeks just to have a back and forth letter. But we had just sort of very kind of just discussions about philosophy of technology and the nature of the technological system and how it works and his basic thesis. And then I started asking him some challenging questions because I know that nobody had really sort of pressed back on some of his points in his manifesto. And there was several points that were debatable. And so I started sort of playing devil's advocate. I was pressing back and saying, well, what would you say to someone who said this? And what about this point? And did you really think about this? And so forth. And then he would respond to my challenges with detailed, lengthy points, defenses, basically defending his own views. Eventually, we had several dozen letters, high quality letters of lots of detailed writings from him in response to my queries. And then he had the unpublished essays, and I suggested at one point maybe we should put together a book, which he agreed. That ultimately resulted in the book that you showed there, Peter, Technological Slavery. That's the second edition. There was a first edition that came out in 2010. I wrote the introduction to the first book as well, and then in both copies, both editions, there's about 100 pages of letters to me that Kaczynski has excerpted, and he put those in the copies of those of that book, of both editions of that book. In the meantime, I continued my own work, sort of my own critical work. I was teaching philosophy of technology at Michigan, very skeptical, very critical of technological society. I published a textbook basically that I was using for the course. It was called Confronting Technology. It's available today. It's on Amazon. You can buy it. It's a collection of historical critiques of technology. Nothing like that had existed before. I went back through history, all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and collected the excerpts that them and other prominent thinkers throughout history who had made writings and comments that were critical of technology of their various eras. So it's really an instructive book to kind of see that the history of the philosophy criticism over, say, 2,000 years. It's really kind of a striking continuity of thought that accelerates, of course, as technology itself accelerates over that same period of time. So I developed that as a textbook. I was teaching from that textbook. Eventually, I developed sort of my own views, my own philosophy of technology. This was published with Routledge, major publisher, in 2015 with my book called The Metaphysics of Technology. So it's completely written by myself. It's kind of my own theory, own critical theory about what technology is, how it works, why it's sort of this sort of compelling, inevitable process that we don't seem to be able to stop or control. So I give a little bit of a metaphysical explanation, if you will, about how I think this works and where it's heading and what we might be able to do, as limited as it might be. There's some options that we have, some actions that we could take. So I put that together and, like I said, published that in 2015. So that kind of brings us up to the present day. I have not had a lot of extensive interaction with Kaczynski in the last handful of years, we haven't had any reason to do much correspondence. He's working on a follow-up second volume of Technological Slavery. This will probably take at least a year yet. It's a slow process. The prison is being less than helpful in some ways, and that's slowing the process down. But he's continuing to work and to write and to produce at least the second volume of that book. And if he has time and if his health holds up, maybe even another volume will come out down the road. So the basic philosophy, right? If we want to talk about the philosophy of the Unabomber, which to me is important, because when we talk about the Unabomber, of course, the immediate thought comes to mind of the bombing spree and the 3 people who he killed. And so, of course, I don't condone that. I don't support it. I don't endorse it in any way. But I think that needs to be kept separate from the ideas that he's been advocating and that are in the manifesto. So we have to take the crimes, we put that to one side. We say, okay, those were terrible crimes. There were victims. Kaczynski was caught, he was punished, he was sentenced to trial, found guilty, and he's sentenced to life in prison. So that was his punishment. Okay, so that's that. And then we have the issues, the arguments about the technological system, how it's functioning, how we should respond, and those are still there. So whether we talk about Kaczynski or not, it does us no good to sort of ignore his ideas, because us and our descendants and the future generations are going to be faced with the consequences of a technological system that's accelerating out of our control and could well expose us to catastrophic scenarios in the next few decades. So that's entirely possible. So it's incumbent upon us to address those problems in a serious way. And Kaczynski did do that. He addressed those in a very serious, in a very rational way. So to his credit, he is a brilliant individual. There's no doubt about it. He did give a very insightful critique. It was based on some existing ideas in Elul and some other thinkers. That's okay, but he just put them in a new context and came to some really strong conclusions. The basic view, of course, from Kaczynski, and it's at the beginnings of the manifesto, is that we are faced with a technological system that's really a completely unnatural entity. It's unnatural for the planet. It's unnatural for human beings. It's something unlike that we or the planet have ever faced in all of evolutionary history. So because of this, and because it has a very potent ability to act and to alter the environment, the human environment and the natural environment, so it's causing harm. It's causing harm to humans in several ways. It's causing harm to nature. Clearly, it's without advanced technology, obviously we would not have as many people as we do on the planet. We would not have as many means at our disposal to exploit nature. And we simply wouldn't have the power, the economic systems and the transportation systems, the energy systems to cause as much damage as we do. So it's clear that the technological system is damaging both the human environment and the natural environment. It's getting worse. By virtually any criterion, the technological system is getting stronger, and it's causing increasing damage all around the planet. The obvious solution, of course, is to try to identify the problems, analyze them, and fix them. This is the typical reform process that we would do for most any sphere of social problems, right? We would just pinpoint the problem, define it, analyze it, come up with a solution, and implement the solution. That's called the reform process. In some cases, that works. In some fields of action, that works, but it seems to not work with technology. So with the major technological problems that we faced, we seem to not really be able to identify and implement focused, truly valid long-term solutions to our problems. We tend to come up with ad hoc solutions that patch over problems. Superficially, we'll solve them for a while. We'll tend to push off the damage to a different space or time. And additionally, we'll produce side effects, which maybe many of which would have been unanticipated, and in some cases are actually worse than the original problem. So this is the typical result of a reform process when we try to apply it to technology. So Kaczynski's argument basically, and I would tend to concur, is that reform simply does not seem to work when we come with the major problems of technological society. So we have a system that's growing, that's damaging already, it's harmful today, it's growing in power by the day. We cannot meaningfully reform that system to eliminate those problems. And therefore, we're on a road to potential catastrophe, both for ourselves and for the planet. So the only plausible alternative in Kaczynski's mind is something like a revolution, right? So he wants to basically end the systems, take what actions we can, if we can, and what small chance that we might have to undermine the system, to sort of pull the plug on the system, if you will, to bring it down or to deflate it or to deconstruct it in some way, to revolt against it, if you will. To get back to a much simpler technological infrastructure, and is to view that as maybe a long-term solution and say, well, look, maybe that will be the long-term solution whereby humanity can survive, albeit at lower levels, and that nature can survive, and we may be around for the long haul at that point. But there's a good reason to think unless we take some drastic action like a revolutionary action, there's good reason to think that we will not survive through the end of the century. And much of nature will not survive either. So I guess kind of that's the basic view of Kaczynski. That's the basis of his argument. The manifesto covers other topics. For those of you who've read the manifesto, there's a long beginning piece in the manifesto. He's talking about sociological issues. He's talking about problems with leftism and the power process. So there's various reasons for that. He's concerned about leftist dilution of an anti-tech movement. Power process, right? He wants to show sort of how people live in a very unnatural, non-evolutionary kind of mode of existence where we no longer sort of have this immediate connection to our basic needs. We've been disempowered by a technological system, which is causing psychological problems in people. So there's a lot of, let's say, ancillary and preparatory discussion that takes up about a third of the manifesto. And it takes quite a while. If you've read it, you really have to go through a lot of background and related ideas before you actually get to the critique of technology. But then he goes through kind of the basic attack on technology, how we cannot reform it. It's growing out of our control. The process causes increasing harms. It causes psychological harm. It causes physical harm. Eventually leading to something like a revolutionary strategy as the only viable option. So that's the basis, I guess, of his philosophical outlook. Much of it is, like I say, is drawn from previous thinkers. So you can find a lot of these ideas. If you've actually read Ellul's book, The Technological Society, you'll see a lot of connections. In fact, Kaczynski did read Ellul. This is where he drew, I think, some of his basic ideas. And there's other critical thinkers who've argued for revolutionary views prior to Kaczynski. People like Ivan Illich and Lewis Mumford, even in his own way, was sort of a revolutionary. Herbert Marcuse, and there's some other thinkers, serious thinkers, who sort of basically adopted a kind of a revolutionary view against the system. So Kaczynski was not the first. I mean, his basic critique. The basic ideas had been around for a while. Even the revolutionary thesis had been around for a number of years before he came along. But of course, he had, I mean, like any of us, right? You're sort of grabbing old existing ideas, you put them in a new form, you write them in a new way, you apply them to a new era, you sharpen the points, you make them clearer. I mean, things in Ellul were not entirely clear, and Kaczynski did a great job, I think, in the manifesto. He really captured the essential points. He put it in very clear, no nonsense sort of prose, got right to the point. He's pulling no punches, clearly not concerned about being politically correct. Obviously, he's offending various groups along the way. So, okay, that's his style. He has a right to do that. And he goes right to the conclusion, and he pulls no punches again on the conclusion that revolution is absolutely necessary. So it's maybe his construction of the ideas that's unique, his contribution to sort of this philosophical critique. Like I say, the critique itself had been around for centuries. But he brings some new aspects to the situation, new approaches, brings it kind of to the modern present day, and he does it in a way that's, let's say, because of his unconditional view and his unrestrained attack. He's not bothered by these restrictions, obviously the conditions under which he wrote, that, let's say, ordinary intellectuals or academics would be restrained from saying. So there's certain things that an intellectual or academic person or a professor or a professional writer might not want to talk about because it's either looks difficult or has a bad image or would cast bad light on your university or your employer. You can imagine lots of reasons. So Kaczynski had the luxury of writing as a lone individual. Obviously, he's writing alone in his house in Montana. So he can really just literally say exactly what he wants. And through the bombing campaign, he has the leverage to use it against the government to get it published in a high visibility venue, which is what he did when it was published in the Washington Post in 1995. And I think that day when he published it in the manifesto, it was a huge number of newspapers that sold. I think the figure I have in mind was like 1.2 million copies of that paper sold that day, which I think is still an all-time record for a single day's sales of newspapers anywhere, ever. So clearly he got the impact that he wanted. He got the visibility he wanted. 6 months later, it cost him his freedom because he was incarcerated. It almost cost him his life. But he managed to avoid the death penalty. And so he's alive and he's writing today, and his books are there. And I think we're fortunate to have him. Of course, he's been the topic of documentaries and Netflix, a couple of documentaries, and two or three total at least that I'm aware of. So he seems to be getting more publicity these days. There's ongoing interest on the internet. People are sort of intrigued by his ideas and his arguments. I think people are saying, at least I'm seeing responses from people saying, well, maybe he was right. I mean, he had some pretty good ideas, and the things that he's talking about seem to be coming true in the present day society. Of course, things are much different today, 2021, than they were back in 1990 or 95, right, when he was writing his manifesto. So, I mean, you think about even the early 90s, there was really no such thing as email. There was really no functional internet. It was a very localized, specialized tool. No social media, no cell phones. Hugely different environment in terms of individual, personal involvement in technology. But much of what he said is come to reality in the last 30 years or so. So maybe I'll leave it at that as a kind of a summary of the history and his views, if that's probably a good context. I guess people must be familiar with his ideas in his books, and maybe that's a good point to bring in some other voices or bring in questions. I'm happy to discuss things.
Beautiful. Yeah, that was a good summary. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We have a few already. And everyone, we might not get to everyone. We probably won't go in the order they arrive in the chat. And I'll warm up David with some questions of my own. So yeah, the first thing that comes up is during your kind of historical examination of the various critiques on technology, was there any consistent critiques that you found emerged? Is there any maybe critique taxonomy as well that you've discovered?
Kind of taxonomy of the critiques?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a good point. I don't know that I really thought about putting a structure around it, but I mean, there are themes about sort of this. It's kind of at least in the very early days, it was kind of a lowly and degrading thing, right? I mean, if you go back to the Greeks, and they're sort of like the ancient Greeks, we're talking like 500 BC. So Plato and Aristotle wrote critically about the technicians of their day. So these were, in fact, they called them mechanics. They basically had that word. It's a Greek word, mechanic. And these guys were, of course, just simple tool makers, and they were making, furniture or stone cutters or whatever. And the mechanics of the day, they viewed as a kind of a lowly thing. It was sort of looked down upon. It was a low class thing because you were involved in material stuff, just things, making things, building tools, and that was a really kind of a undignified existence, right? So the proper life for a thinking person was something more elevated and more academic, if you will, more intellectual. So that was kind of the early themes about is this sort of lowly and degrading. When you moved into the Christian era, it was something that maybe took you, because it was material stuff, it took you away from God and religion and spirituality and so forth. Eventually, sort of the power sort of became known, and the critics were seeing how it was had the power to disrupt the earth. So you're talking about critiques of mining and extraction of minerals. And they would say, well, look, we can extract these minerals, and it's nice because you can dig up gold and silver. So we build up our wealth, but we also have this iron, which we use to make tools that kill people. So they immediately understood the dual nature, the two-sided nature of this technology process. It's bringing us wealth, but it's also bringing us deadly things that are causing pain and suffering and killing people. So you kind of see this kind of develop over time, this kind of two-sided, two-bladed sword, if you will, of technology. And then even by the mid-1800s, you get this idea that the process is growing out of our control. I mean, there's a striking essay by Samuel Butler, I think it's 1865 or 1863, and he's looking at a mechanical steam shovel, a steam engine-driven steam shovel, and seeing how fast this thing is digging up the earth. And there's a really brilliant little essay. He's like, these things are going to outstrip us. They're like going to outgrow us. They're going to exceed us. We need to destroy these machines now. I mean, this is like the first revolutionary statement in history. It's like from 1865, Samuel Butler, he's like ready to smash all the machines, literally smash them, because if we don't stop this, these things are going to grow beyond our ability. They're going to displace us. They're going to outgrow. They're going to surpass us. He's thinking like almost in evolutionary terms. You really kind of see these. It's interesting how that process parallels the power of the technology of that time. So, yeah, it's really an interesting story.
And my follow-up, and then we'll pivot to the Q&A, is the whole techno-optimist and transhumanist movement, sort of like it's like reversed. It's almost there's a religiosity around tech and it's become a god. What is your take on that, or perhaps Ted's take on that? How that has manifested these days?
Transhumanism, right? So it's basically some kind of integration or blending of humans and technology, presumably, or using technology to enhance humans, or some kind of cyborg future, right? Or some kind of melding with technology, and you got all the Ray Kurzweil scenarios where you're augmenting your abilities with some kind of integrated, virtual reality stuff, or you're eventually going to download your mind into a computer, right? And all these kind of nifty little scenarios. I guess that's all part of this transhumanist future. I mean, Kaczynski no doubt is appalled at all this. I mean, from what I've seen of his writings, I'd have to agree. I mean, it's really sort of, it really involves a kind of, to really change, to attempt to change your own nature so much is a kind of expression of extreme dissatisfaction, and you might even say self-loathing or self-hatred, right? Where you're so dissatisfied with your human form that you somehow think you need to supplement it with these technological powers, right? That gives you these superhero powers or these promises to, but at the same time is going to strip you of what would be your essential humanity. So it's a kind of a Faustian bargain, right? You're selling away your native humanity and your native abilities and your sort of humanness to try to prolong your life, your existence, to give superior abilities of some kind. And I mean, I think in the end, not only is it undignified, I mean, it's doomed to failure, right? I mean, even and Kaczynski's made this point too. If you get some kind of super AI future, and you're talking about downloading your mind, into some giant database, what makes you think that the AI programs that are sort of running the show in the future are going to decide it's even worth their time to keep you around in some little file over here that's called, Ray Kurzweil file, or David Skrbina file, whatever it might be. Who's going to keep that around? They're just going to sort of get rid of you. They have no incentive. If there's really a system that's really operating autonomously, there's really no incentive to keep you around, to do anything for you. More likely could cause tremendous kind of disruption of your own existence. Most likely would just obliterate you. So there's no reason that you can sort of predict this kind of super high-tech future. There's so many unknown scenarios and so many foreseeable, even predictable sort of outcomes where it's not going to turn out well, that I think the whole transhumanist thing is really misguided. It's just sort of a comic book future that people want to try to turn themselves into some kind of superhero for laughs or for entertainment or to gain some temporary edge, I don't know, competitive edge or something. But I think that trend is that's a disaster to pursue that path, frankly.
All right, that should engender some interesting questions, I imagine. So we'll start with Max. Max, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
So in the Wikipedia page, because I don't know much of this guy, but there's mention of him being involved in 3 years psychological experiment when he was at university as part of MK Ultra. And so it seems like this has been like a key component to his fanaticization. Do you know more about that? And what do you think made that guy who was basically a prodigy take such radical action instead of just writing a manifesto and expressing his idea, let's say, peacefully?
Well, right. So there's a lot of discussion about Kaczynski when he was an undergraduate at Harvard. He was involved in some aspects, minor aspects, I think of. And I don't actually. I mean, they talk about MK Ultra. I don't know if that was even formally part of the process. I think the people that he was working with somehow had an affiliation with this MK Ultra thing. So it was a very indirect connection. But in any case, it was really a very minor episode from everything that I've seen. There was one of the individuals was trying to examine how people react under duress when you put them under stress. And so he was bringing in selected undergraduates, and he was asking, it was just an interview process, nothing more than just normal question and answer. And he was poking at them, pressing them on their ideas and challenging them and sort of being deliberately belligerent and insulting them and just really kind of being aggressive, try to put them under a stressful situation, then to see how they would respond. And I've actually seen the transcripts of these interviews, at least some of them, where Kaczynski is being questioned, and this professor fellow, he's asking very hard, kind of tough, almost rude or insulting questions, and Kaczynski's getting a little upset, and he's pushing back, he's defending himself, he's doing a good job, he's trying to be polite about it, and so forth. So I mean, that was really the extent of it. It was I think it was a couple-day process. It was a series of a few hours of interviews. It was really nothing more than that. And it's been made to be a big kind of deal because people are trying to find an excuse why Kaczynski would take these extreme actions of sending bombs to people. I mean, that's any way you slice it, that's an extreme action, right? And they're saying, well, look, maybe this MK Ultra thing did something and it messed with his head and made him hate the humanity or made him crazy or something. I mean, that's really all nonsense. Everything that I've seen, that's complete nonsense. So, I mean,
Hitler, he made the mistake of thinking that violence is the answer. He had good intentions. It's just that he killed people.
We'll go in order with the Q&A. Sorry, Richard.
Yeah.
Sorry, David.
Well, right. So right, but everything that I know, there's no connection to what happened in his earlier life or as an undergrad. There's really no connection to the MK Ultra supposed program at all. It seems to be later that Kaczynski really sort of developed this kind of burning hatred towards the technological system and towards individual people in that process, right? So of course, if your opponent is a system, what's a system? It's a whole technological infrastructure. and there's no easy target. You can't target a whole system. It's a whole infrastructure. It's a power grid. It's communications. It's a whole network that's involved. So Kaczynski took, I don't know all of his thinking, but by all accounts, he picked selected individuals who are key people in various aspects of this development of a technological system, and he targeted those people. Again, we don't know the whole thinking. I don't know the whole rationale. His stated argument was he was doing this to ultimately gain the notoriety and the leverage to publish the manifesto in a high visibility venue. So in that sense, it worked and he succeeded. So, I mean, like it or not, I mean, it worked. He was able to, he basically blackmailed the United States government and they gave in. They conceded and they allowed the publication of his complete manifesto. It was really an astonishing fact that one individual in a cabin in Montana can blackmail the United States government and get away with it. And he did it. So it's really an astonishing fact. Yeah, I mean, whether we like it or not, obviously, that's like I say, it was a criminal action, and he suffered for that. I guess, was it a mistake? Well, of course, he got caught 6 months later. I suppose maybe he must have known. I mean, he must have known there was a chance that eventually he would get caught. Presumably, he might have thought he would have been killed in the process. You can't imagine you're going to survive that whole process. But I guess probably at that point he was willing to sacrifice even his own life to get the manifesto published in this high visibility way. And in that he succeeded. And he probably figures anything that happens after that, well, that's just bonus. That's just the gravy, you know. If I can do a book or I can write some things in prison because I'm not dead, then he'll do that. So that's kind of my assessment anyway.
Any follow-up share, Max?
Yeah, it was time. You know, he was stupid.
Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Max.
You know, I just wonder then what is the thing that really fanaticized him, you know,
That really what?
That fanaticized him, you know, is it like mental illness or is it like
yeah, okay, well, right, so right, it was an extreme action, right? Obviously you plan a bomb and I mean, that's an extreme action by any assessment. So I mean, okay, so all throughout history we've had extreme individuals who've taken extreme actions, and we could go through a psychological study of every extreme person, you know, in all of history. Well, we don't know. It's something about their background and their convictions, and they're making a rationale, right? Even if I'm going to rationally kill somebody, there's a kind of rationale. Well, I'm taking a risk, and maybe it's worth the risk, and there's some trade-offs involved. It's not just a mindless. I'm not just picking, you know, random people and just killing them. I mean, some people do that too, and then they're purely mentally ill. But this was a rational process. So he's doing a calculation. He knows there's a risk. Of course, you're making bombs. There's a risk it blows up in your face and you're dead, right? So he's making all these kind of calculations and he's weighing them, and he clearly decided to take the action that he did. Now, obviously, most of us would never even make that kind of calculation, let alone take those actions. But all throughout history, there's always people who are sort of in this extreme end of thinking, and there's that committed and that you know, that focused on their task that they'll do anything to fulfill their missions. And he was one of those individuals.
Awesome. Thank you, Max. So we have a question from Robert. Robert, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, my question is, so I've read Technological Slavery. I thought the points were quite original and not something you come across in the mainstream literature. I was interested in what your perspective was on Ted's solution, which is around basically revolution. Because when I think about the role of technology, you know, it can be extended to almost anything that provides some sort of asymmetric force or influence. You know, the person who invented weapons, that was a technology, or the printing press, right? Be able to influence mass opinion. So it seems to me like there's this fundamental root in, you know, kind of human nature even, which I think Ted respects because he's all about, you know, not changing human nature. And just the question around how enforcement would work too as well, because there's a huge coordination problem around how to maintain a lack of technology and who gets to decide on what that standard is. And as long as one group uses technology, it creates an arms race for all the other groups being able to use it. So what's your take on sort of not his diagnosis, but on his solution and whether that's even feasible?
Yeah. Okay. So there were several issues there that could probably take another hour to discuss. So technology in general is intrinsic to human nature. So we've had technology tools as long as there have been human beings. So 2 million years or more. We've used stone tools and wood tools. So that's been around forever. So it's not a question of extracting all technology, all tools from humans, because that's what we do, right? There's no chance. As long as a human exists, we're going to use some tools. The question is what kind of tools and the power of those tools. Kaczynski focuses, certainly at the beginning of the manifesto, on the Industrial Revolution. So it's the energetic tools that come out of the use of fossil fuels, say beginning in 1700, which really accelerates the process that leads to powered machines, powered factories, production of electricity, and then all the things that flow from that. So if you want to sort of bring this system down, you've got to at least go back, and this is maybe more my view, at least go back prior to the worst phase, which was the industrial phase, the fossil fuel driven phase. So if you have any hope of succeeding, you've got to get prior to this industrial revolution phase, prior to, say, the year 1700, when we had fossil fuels driving the system forward. Now, obviously, there's a big question, right, about how it goes from where you're at today to backing things down to getting to a simpler level. Like you say, if somebody unilaterally decides they're going to kind of simplify their national infrastructure because they want to minimize the risks and they want to survive in the long run, and that creates a power differential. So you have other nations who have more technological power than you, and that puts you at risk. But I guess first point is, of course, that exists today anyway. You have that power differential today, no matter what we do, and you're going to have it tomorrow, no matter what we do. So we're going to have those power differentials. There's various rules, whatever rules of international behavior, and there's international treaties, and there's the United Nations. Everything sort of plays a role, even though we have these huge power differentials today. Generally, we don't have, at least that's what it's been, I guess, between the major powers anyway, we have not had those kind of major wars that are going on. I suppose it could change in the future. But yeah, conceivably that there's a risk there that maybe we have to take if we want to survive. I guess ideally there'd be some kind of coordination at a high level. Maybe there's a role for the UN or some new body that's something like the UN, where you say, look, we're going to collectively, we need to face the nature of this global industrial technology, which is collectively destroying our planet. And maybe we need to collectively agree on the rules by which we're going to sort of walk our way out of this process. And it could be a relatively slow and gradual and rational process. There's nothing that says it wouldn't be. Kaczynski says the same thing himself. He says even his revolution could be a slow, gradual process. It doesn't have to be a big, dramatic, overnight kind of thing. So there's many open questions about how it would proceed, how we could go into the future, how we could protect individual nations, who might choose to take action. I think there are ways forward. They're not without risk, but of course there's risk in proceeding the way we're going now. So it's a matter of balancing those kind of risks.
Any follow-up question?
Yeah, just one follow-up question, which is I understand that Kaczynski's view is that it's hard to predict what's going to happen. Let's say if you change the technological core of society, it's not clear about what society will merge out of that. And the question is whether or not you're willing to take that risk. But does he have a view on what even like an inkling of viable alternative is? Because if the alternative to technological progress is a world where there's massive starvation because the population can't be supported, on pre-industrial age tools.
Right, sure.
And if let's say, in order to even enforce this mandate on technology or kind of set limits on it, it would increase government power to an extent where it's almost an extreme infringement on freedoms, because it goes contrary to kind of human nature and their desire to explore and to improve. Then, shouldn't there be an evaluation of kind of the potential costs there as well, or shouldn't be there stronger formation of what that world could be?
Right. Well, right. So the short answer is the alternative to technological progress is technological regress. And again, if that takes place slowly and relatively gradually, it could take a full century, maybe over 100 years. If we do a planned regression over 100 years, there's no mass die-off, there's no mass starvation. If you plan and you sort of also have to balance the human condition. So you're right. For example, in a much simpler technological system, you cannot support 8 billion people, or we're going to be at 10 billion people by mid-century. So we have to have, at the same time, collective agreement that we're going to get down to a much smaller level of population. If you reduce the power of your technological system, including agriculture and so forth, it's producing the food, you've got to scale down the human numbers. So there's nothing that would stop us in principle from scaling down both the technological system and the population levels on a gradual and a comparable basis over, say, 100 years. And that would be eminently doable. And there's no coercion, and there's no mass dying, and there's no mass, a slaughter of people. And it could be, at least, certainly in principle, it could be a relatively manageable and feasible process.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Robert. So perhaps we'll end with Lisa's question. Lisa Norton, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much. I think I'm building on Robert's point. I apologize that I hadn't read your work on the metaphysics of technology, and I suppose you cover this, but maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more on how you draw, or do you draw, an ontological distinction between nature and technology, dating in particular from the Industrial Revolution, as you just seemed that. I'm curious about, if you could say more about how the exponential ability to extend ourselves shifts the nature of being. If you could just elaborate on that.
Yeah. Again, so there are lots of angles to that, but in general, I tend to disagree with the popular distinction between natural and artificial. So people tend to think of technology, and particularly advanced technology, as something that's completely different from nature. So you have natural conditions, the nature itself, and then these technological systems. But philosophically or metaphysically, if you will, there's no difference, right? These are just tools, fancy tools, powerful tools. They're using natural processes. They're using elements of nature. They're using electricity and all these things which exist obviously in nature. We're not getting these things from another dimension or from some alien, beings or something. It's really all just very sophisticated natural tools. So philosophically, there's a continuum, and this is what I argued in my book. It's really a continuum of process, of simple tools to more complex tools to power-driven tools, but it's all, there's a gradual progression there. And it's just sort of, at some point, it becomes tools that we can control and manage, the tools that we cannot really control or really manage. So, but it's a continuum. There's no arbitrary break point. There's no sort of dramatic shift in the existence of the tools before and after the Industrial Revolution. So I argue in my book for a very continuous kind of view, kind of really a very holistic sort of view, that these things are part of nature. It's a natural process. Technology grows by really a kind of a natural process in itself. It's kind of understandable how it works. It's kind of this energy extraction process that's going on. It's working its way through us. But again, it's something that we're sort of building this higher order existence, which I think we we're really losing sight of. We really, it's sort of really beyond the ability of individual organisms like ourselves to really control or to understand this process. So we've really kind of outbuilt ourselves. We've outconstructed a system that we really no longer really understand how this thing works and what it's doing even to us in the long run. So there's a lot of interesting metaphysical issues. I try to make that case in the book, and like I say, if anybody's interested, of course, I'd refer you to the book for kind of the more complete case there.
Any follow-up shares, Lisa?
Just a quick comment. Thank you for that. So sounds like a lot to do with the range of our individual agency or small collective agency, but I wonder if that doesn't, your answer, I agree, it's more of a continuum. And I wonder if that folds into Max Goslin's point about solar punk futures and harmonizing with technology.
So, right, there's one sense, maybe in the long run, we may lose out in this race. It's kind of a race to control our future in a sense. And if it really is kind of this evolutionary process, which is really what I've been arguing for in my book, there may be a sense in which, in the long run, we really cannot win this battle, if you will, this sort of struggle for our own existence. And maybe it's like every species has a certain lifespan, and maybe it's millions of years, but eventually evolution moves on, and the environment changes, and they go away. They lose out to superior forms of being. And I suppose it's conceivable that maybe there's some kind of techno-biological fusion future, which could be the future of evolution. And maybe the biological creatures like us, maybe we lose out in the very long run. I guess the point is, why would you bring about your own demise any sooner than is necessary, right? I mean, we do this all the time. We all know we're going to die, all of us, but most of us would rather have that be later rather than sooner, right? So, and we take lots of effort to maintain ourselves so that we don't face that inevitability. I think we as a human species should do the same thing. Even if we think in the long run, maybe we're doomed or we're going to lose out to some technological fusion or something. Well, let's make that in the very long run. Let's push that 10,000 years down the future, which is just a blink of a time in evolutionary terms. And let's let our species and the rest of the species, have this long and happy a run as we can on this planet before, if in fact we lose out, maybe we do lose out. But that's no reason to invite the process. You don't advance technology to bring about your own demise any sooner than you need to. You would do the opposite. You would try to sustain yourselves in your natural condition, as healthy and as normal and as natural as you possibly can. And that's part of the motivation behind this, say, anti-tech or de-tech movement.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. Do you have time for one last question, David, or did you have
I have time, absolutely, no problem.
Cool. Let's go with the wild man himself, Anjan. Anjan, if you have a question.
Thanks, Peter. Hey, David.
Yeah.
I'd spent like 6 months of my life going deep on Ted's work, your work, the associated work, Jacques Vallée, Lewis Mumford, and so on. You had a huge role in impacting my life. So I just wanted to say thank you for the work you've done.
Thanks.
One of the things I did after this is I was basically convinced by the argument that if you solve the environmental mismatch, that humans would be happier. And so I wanted to meet people who had spent lots of time with different types of hunter-gatherers, because it's so location specific. So I was curious. ASU had a school where they kind of had the people who had spent the most amount of time with different hunter-gatherer groups, and lots of lunchtime conversations with the professors who had done this. And I guess to put it concisely, I was pretty surprised by, they were like, the human condition is the human condition. Even if you solve evolutionary mismatch, a lot of these people I worked with, be it in New Guinea or the Philippines or Uruguay or whatever it was, they still could benefit from Buddhism and Stoicism, is the way you put it. Like the inward journey is still the hardest part about well-being, even if you solve the environmental mismatches and problems. So I guess I was pretty stunned by that. Obviously, it's clear that there's less on the negatives, like neuroticism, depression, those type of things are less. But very plainly, the conclusion from a lot of them was that they were not really any more content or happier. And so I was just wondering, what do you make of that?
So the hunter-gatherers were no happier than us. Is that right?
Yeah, maybe they suffered from less neuroticisms, but on average, they weren't any more content or happier.
Yeah. So of course, I mean, happiness is a hugely problematic thing, and this is for more than 2,000 years. We don't really know how to define or measure this thing called happiness, and it's very risky, of course, to try to apply modern industrial standards to pre-industrial people and say, hey, are you as happy as we are? I mean, what could that even mean, right?
And that wouldn't be the question asked, because when you ask them about happiness, they don't actually know what you mean, because that's an assessment, right? You ask about joy,
right, exactly,
and relationships.
Well, exactly. Right. So you have to look at things like, right. So maybe some kind of mental illness, maybe social stability, maybe maybe sort of flourishing of the society in some sense. I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, but I can imagine that, right, there's sort of various criterion that you would use, right? But to me, I mean, the ultimate criteria, of course, is survival in the long run. So if you're able to persist and survive, somehow you have a viable lifestyle. And hunter-gatherer is the only proven sustainable lifestyle for Homo sapiens. Nothing else is proven sustainable. And we've been able to do hunter-gatherer existence for 2 million years, as long as there's been human beings. So, whether you like it or not, whether it's happy or not, I mean, in a sense, that's all secondary to survival. And that was survival. That was normal and natural. Humans evolved, your brain, your mind, your psyche evolved to live in small bands of people, 50 to 100 people in a vast wilderness, and we survived. And we could do it. And arguably, that's our natural and evolved mode of existence. So, call it what you will, whether they're running around laughing and playing or they're just sort of, grimly surviving. Well, I mean, that's our natural mode of existence. And anything else is sort of abnormal, unusual, and it puts us under stress. And it's not surprising that we exhibit the kind of collective neuroses that we do when we've been so removed from what is our evolved natural condition. So I guess that's how I would address that. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Anjan. So we're at the top of the hour now. David, any closing thoughts you would like to leave us with today?
No, I mean, I'm just sort of happy that people are willing to take the idea seriously. That Kaczynski is kind of he's a notorious figure, obviously, for lots of reasons. I don't want to sort of celebrate his actions because they were criminal actions. I certainly don't, like I say, don't endorse them. But it is an opportunity for us to discuss these very serious problems. So for me personally, I mean, I'm happy to have the discussion. I'll take almost any opportunity that I can to sort of raise these issues because it involves our collective future, our collective survival. And if we do it in the context of a Ted Kaczynski, that's fine with me. If we would do it in the context of a Jacques Ellul, or you want to talk about Heidegger or the ancient Greeks, I'm happy to talk about it in any context you like because it's an important issue. Kaczynski is like I say, it's a celebrity cause, and so we can use him in that sense to bring out these issues, which I think is great. And I just happy for the opportunity to talk about it, and I'm just glad that everybody was able to join us here tonight.
Beautiful. I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but David, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa. Definitely recommend checking out the book, Technological Slavery, and check out David's website, which will be on the event description and the YouTube page. He has lots of diverse interests, philosophical interests that I'm looking forward to digging into. So 2 sessions coming up, one tomorrow on Wednesday. Charles Einstein's coming in to the Stoa for a Patreon event. You can check that out. And this individual, Ran Lahav, is doing something called deep philosophy. It's a very interesting intersubjective practice on getting at some philosophical good stuff. So you can check that out. That's a free event. And there's some hunger appetite for a post sense making session. So David, feel free to slip out right now, and I'll play some music, and then people can go on a wash and break, and then we'll stop recording and have a post conversation.
All right, I'll pop out then. Very good.
Thanks, David.
Thanks. Thank you.